Hello, my name's Amanda Foxon-Hill and this is the Suddenly Autistic YouTube channel, I guess. Today I want to talk about relationships, forming relationships as somebody who's autistic, and especially reflecting on relationship theory, which is better known as attachment theory in psychology circles, as I have experienced that as somebody who has been now diagnosed, but prior to that undiagnosed with autism. So how that the psychologist's understanding of relationships and my reality of relationships, where they cross over and are the same and where they are different. So I want to explore all of that from the perspective, from my own personal perspective, because that's the only perspective I have. And in particular, I want to then sort of dive down into the details of all of that, and the misconceptions that can happen and how that's affected me as an individual. This is a source of, or has been especially, a source of a great deal of my trauma throughout my life. So both forming how relationships are formed and how relationships are valued. So it's been a very difficult video to make, in as much as I've recorded and re-recorded to try and get my ideas concise, and still with the right level of importance, I suppose, on how this has affected me. So it has been a very difficult thing to pull together, and I hope now that that I've sort of gone through the cognitive process and can still convey some of the emotions that it's brought up for me. I'm going to just start off by saying I have, since I first remember, I remember struggling with relationships with my peers. So, for example, at preschool, I remember being quite traumatised by the whole experience of going to preschool. I don't remember I can't remember any memories. I don't have any positive memories of me engaging with other children. I felt uncomfortable with the whole thing, and things changed as I got older and went to primary school and then middle school and then high school and then on to uni. But there's been a pervasive distance, is a good way to put it, I think, that I felt between me and other people. Sometimes I felt that distance in a more positive way, that I was somehow, I'm just clever and people don't relate to me, or I'm just, good at stuff and, that's why people find it hard, I might show them up or something. And I understand that may seem a little self-centered, but it didn't feel that way. It's just I was trying to find in those moments something positive about me that I was good at in a world where I didn't feel particularly competent across a broad range of things. I've got a lumpy skill set. In trying to sort of, big up myself, it was an attempt to say, well, maybe I'm not relatable because of this, that, or the other positive trait. On the part of it where I gave up, basically, in terms of relating to masses of other people, I felt like I was different, like I was somehow a bit of an alien, or not actually feeling like I'd fallen from space, but just feeling like there was something about me that was just very different to other people, but not quite putting my finger on what, and not necessarily judging it as positive or negative, but just as it was, and feeling that was curious, but not, again, understanding it. And then, of course, on the negative, which was quite a dominant understanding of myself, it was focusing on all the things that I struggle with and wondering why. Relationships have always been a struggle, suffice to say. That isn't to say I haven't had good relationships and haven't had relationships per se. I always have. I've always had friends. But the dynamics of those have been draining, mostly, whether they've been positive or negative. So when it comes to looking at this and trying to put some structure around it and analysis, I guess, which is what I like to do, I've had a look at attachment theory. As I'm not a psychologist, I'm not going to critique attachment theory per se, but what I am going to do is say how it makes me feel. So that's where I'm starting. And so attachment theory is a theory of relationships and bonds. It's particularly focused on long-term relationships and those between parents and their children and between partners in a relationship, in an intimate relationship. So I wanted to explore, what is a relationship? What does this mean and how do I feel about relationships? What does it mean to relate? Well, relatability as a concept is the quality of being able easily to form social or emotional connections. I feel like I have consistently been able to form social connections to the level of my interest, my investment, my need, desire for such things. I haven't had a problem as such forming social connections. Or emotional connections is where it gets a little bit tricky. Emotional connections, as a young child, the emotional response that you're looking for friends is a little bit different. I definitely made some of my friends cry. I perhaps was a bit rough. In fact, I remember a few occasions at primary school and probably before that where I was excluded from games because I was a little bit forceful and, we're not reading the room, as it were. And that wasn't because I was trying to be or force myself as a bully. It was that I had no real insight into how my presence was showing up in that situation. So social connections, yes, I was as popular as I needed to be and wanted to be. Emotional connections I often struggled with, although I must say, as I've grown up, I have found levels of emotional connections with people throughout my life, and some of them have been very successful. That says whether we've always been on the same wavelength in actuality is debatable. Relatable, that's a feeling of that you can understand and have sympathy with, or with somebody or something else. I definitely can relate to other people in a way, and have I have at times had too much sympathy for other people as opposed to empathy for them. So sympathy and empathy are something that I've struggled with, and often I have been very affected by the emotions of other people, probably too much for my own good, definitely. But relatability, yes. I mean, when and this is actually one of the reasons why I limit my social circle now as an adult, because up to this point I have struggled more with the information that other people give me and how to process that. So I have to limit the amount of input coming in because it overwhelms me, and has made me feel quite or has led to me feeling quite upset and discombobulated and confused and whatever. So yeah, because it's usually down to the cognitive side of this information. What do I do with it? Then we come to what is a relationship. A relationship, and these are definitions from a dictionary, online dictionary. A relationship, a way in which two or more people or things are connected, or the state of being connected. So this might be with a parent and a child, where there's a nurturing role, so that's the nature of that relationship, one of care and protection. Another example of, or another way of interpreting relationship is the state of being connected. So it could be a familiar relationship, a DNA. So you might be related to people, but not really be nurtured or cared or protected by them. You might not even know them, but you're still related to them. So that's another layer. And the third one is the way in which two or more people or group regard and behave towards each other. And I call this the fitability scale, behaviour towards each other. I feel it's the behaviour towards each other, the way that the interactions are happening between each other is what attachment theory is looking at. So a lot of early attachment theory work was about observing the relationships between primary carer and child, and then interpreting that behaviour into something, making something of that. Understanding others helps to build real connections and deeper relationships, but this does also require us to understand where the other person is coming from. And in my darkest moments, this is where it's been really, really depressing, to be honest. And I don't say that lightly. It's been chronically invalidating. So I've often been the recipient of misguided empathy, and I'm reading this off my screen so I don't ramble too much. This is where I've had people listen to what I've said wholeheartedly and intently and ask me questions, but still miss the point, still not understood me. So I have had friendships where I've opened up I don't have a problem with opening up. I am an open book, pretty much. And when that's happened, I've often found that, people have got the wrong end of the stick, or they've not quite fully understood me, or they're putting too much emphasis on something that I'm not, and that has felt chronically invalidating and isolating, to be honest. It hasn't led to me shutting down and giving up particularly, although it has led to me moving on from certain friendships and relationships, because it feels like, what's the point? This isn't really, it's not that they're not listening, it's just that they don't have the capacity to understand. And that's something they have to get. I can't bring that for them. So even when I don't understand myself, that's fairly obvious. Even when I do understand myself and I'm trying to very consciously construct how I'm talking to people so that they do understand, and if they are interested, of course, I'm not going to force this on people, then this can also be negatively construed, and it can be put down to, when I'm talking, it can be put down to this idea of over-explaining. Fine, but you don't understand me when I get to the point, so I'm trying to make sure that no stone is left unturned, and that's something that I've heard a lot of people who are autistic say that they've had to do too. Attachment theory is about relationships. There's these different levels. I relate to them, I can understand, I have formed relationships of different types. So what else is there to do with attachment theory? Attachment theory centres around the importance of emotional connection. So it's not just being relational and having relationships, it's about this other point of how those relationships form. Where is the connection point, and specifically how is that on an emotional level? And I feel that this is where, as somebody who's autistic, this is where I become, again, chronically invalidated and misunderstood by the tools that, to be honest, you can't even get past. For me, as somebody going to try and get a process of understanding about themselves, which might include an autism diagnosis, if I meet the criteria, it was hard to get past the attachment theory, to be honest. There was lots of therapists who wanted to talk about that, focus on that, do that first, even though I was saying by that point, look, I've done a lot of work on myself. I'm fairly happy with, my family relationships and how I relate and all of that, and I understand that, and I feel this is something more. And I think part of that problem in the psychology community is the importance they place on the way that attachment theory has been constructed, the fundamental premise of it, and that's what this is about. So attachment theory centres around the importance of an emotional connection, and emotional connectedness is about learning as much about each other as possible, being vulnerable and having psychological safety, being able to support each other and having insight. I didn't know I was autistic until I was 46. I'm now nearly 48, so that's a lot of life where I didn't have insight to grant myself psychological safety. Vulnerability, yes, but I was being extremely vulnerable in a world that doesn't value deep, long listening and that prefers empathy from their point of view, from the other. This sort of brought up a few things for me, and I said it's really triggered a little bit of the trauma response, which is why I think it's taken me so long to construct this piece. Attachment theory is looking for signs of emotional connection between primary caregivers and their children, between partners in a relationship. What is normal? Who says what's normal? What's preferable? Do we have? Do we judge this? Do we have the best way, the not so, the kind of okay way, and pathological types of attachments? Some of the ways that I have been read in the past have been very negatively, which again doubles down on that feeling invalidated, but not only invalidated, also wrong. The way I attach is wrong. There is something fundamentally wrong with you in a way that is not nice, that is potentially dangerous. Who sets these norms? I don't know. I mean, apart from society, whoever, whatever. But I think the only thing I can know is looking deeper into me as a person. How do I set these norms? How do I know how I relate? How do I relate? So before we can understand a relationship, I think we need to understand each person in the relationship and where they're coming from. I can look at myself now and I can see this sort of pattern that's happened since I can remember. So my questions around how do we relate as a concept is starting off with the self. Who are we? Who do we want to become, maybe? What tools do we have to help us find out? Where do we do this work? Where is it happening within us, within our bodies, within our environments? When do we do this? When are we engaging in this sort of personal development journey? And how do we do this? How do we search? Now, I don't know what other people do. I've had enough of a job understanding myself, but as somebody who's autistic, as me personally, who am I? I find out who I am by myself. So it's an autonomous self. That doesn't mean to say that I don't need and look towards the public, to my family, to social norms. I understand and absorb, but more I intellectually observe what's happening in the world and work out how, what's right and what's wrong, what should I do, what shouldn't I do. But in terms of who I am as a fundamental being, I'm searching for that inside of myself. So I'm not looking relationally for that input. I have a feeling that the reason attachment theory is so heavy on emotional connectedness is because a neurotypical way of seeking who they are is first relational, through being mirrored and responded to through things like parents and friends and carers and societies. Did I become autonomous because society didn't, or my parents or whatever didn't reflect me, or was I always like that? Maybe I'll never know, but I have a feeling, my gut feeling, however much I can trust that, is that this is part of the autistic experience, that I seek that sense of myself within myself. So who do I want to become? How do I know what am I going to invest in? Where am I going on this journey of self? Well, I personally am looking to behaviours and other people for patterns, for data, etc., like that, that sort of thing. Like I said, what are the rules? What am I going to get told off for when I'm a kid? How far can I push it? Is this right or wrong? Does this make me a good or bad person? Do people like me or not like me? What are they telling me? What are they saying? What information am I getting? And as such, throughout my life, I'm building up a database. I have a feeling that for the neurotypical crew, and this again might be wrong, that who we want to become is, again, looking relationally, like finding role models and aspiring towards and copying characters and people and adopting that kind of thing. It's not that I wouldn't do that. I mean, a lot of autistic people, me included, would have looked to I don't know, maybe cartoon characters or film characters or whatever, and thought, oh, that'd be good, I want to be them. But it's coming, I feel, from a slightly different perspective. In terms of what tools do we have to find out, I personally am using a lot of brain power to find this stuff out. It's a very conscious thing. How do I find out about myself? I'm looking at data, evidence, patterns, analysis, and I'm looking inwardly to see what feels right for me. Does it feel right or wrong? If it feels wrong, am I going to do it? Do I have to do it? Is it important? Can I push? I feel neurotypicals, in terms of in what tools do they have, I feel like a lot of that is looking for this synchronicity, between the outside world and in, so where it marries up and matches, and a lot of information's going in by osmosis. It's just being absorbed rather than constructed. And as such, and I don't know whether this is right, but when I talk to people who are neurotypical about why do they do things, certain behaviours, even when they know that behaviour isn't really feeling comfortable for them, a lot of the time I'm met with well, I don't know. And it's not that I know why I do anything, but once I become aware of a pattern that I do or something that I do, if it doesn't make me feel right, then, or even if it does, I'm going to explore that to see, well, okay, should I keep doing it or not? Should I change? What's going on? I'm measuring and monitoring myself to the best of my capacity all the time and questioning why I hold on to things that are perhaps not good for me in a way that I'm not sure that is naturally accessible to the average neurotypical person, as in easy. This is easy for me. I just naturally fit like that. Where do we go to do this work? Well, I have a feeling that neurotypicals are doing it subconsciously and don't realise that it's going on, whereas for me, as an autistic person, it's more conscious. Both children growing up and doing it all the time. Neurotypicals are searching how, they're searching passively, whereas I'm searching mostly actively. So it's an active process. Even if the information comes in passively and then I'm mirroring or whatever, there'll be a point when I have to go back and process that in a way that I don't feel the average neurotypical person is doing. I may be wrong, like I said. So what happens then? So we've got a situation where we've got an attachment around emotional connection. We've got emotional connection, building relationships, and the first relationship we build is with ourselves. And I think that what I'm seeing here, in my understanding, is, and my felt reality, is a different motivational axis from my autistic self. It's coming from an autonomous nature, so I'm looking within myself to find out who I am. I'm digging deep within my tools and I'm using analytical processes to find out what I should do and what's right for me. Whereas I'm seeing with neurotypical, it's much more relational. It's a feedback loop. So my behaviour and how it's responded to by others is less important and has been less important for me. It's not been not noticed, but it's not been my main thing. It's like, well, I can't control how other people react to me. Other people's reactions to me might not be rational or might not be coming from a place of understanding me, so it's not right for me to then change to their will when it doesn't feel right for me. It could be constructed as a bit of a rebellion or an oppositional nature. I don't feel it is. I feel it's actually what we should be doing, and that's trying to get to know ourselves in a world that perhaps doesn't know us. And that brings me on to my final thing. Now, I was born in the early 70s, and in the early 70s, I wasn't autistic. Hardly anybody like me was. And that isn't because we weren't autistic, it was because the diagnostic criteria did not know about us, didn't reflect us. There's an article that I have found in doing this research that was published in the British Medical Journal in 2001, September the 15th, and it was entitled "The Prevalence of Autism in Early 1970s May Have Been Underestimated." And the particular British cohort 1970s study, only 5 children were identified as having autism, and that was a rate of 0.45 in 1,000. Using methodology of 2001, 56 cases were identified from that same group, which was a prevalence of 3.76 per 1,000, so quite a lot more, quite a significant jump. So that cohort study of 1970 didn't include me. I don't think any of the studies would have, to be honest, but I was unrecognised as autistic at that time from my birth. I wasn't born in 1970, but 1974, when I wasn't recognised. If I have a look at the history of autism, we've got the time when my parents were growing up, that autistic children were seen to be the result of refrigerator mothers. So cold and unemotional mothers created autistic children. That was the theory of the 50s and into the 60s. Then towards the end of the 60s, we had the DSM-2 and CANA put forward the idea that it was a psychiatric condition stemming from emotional disturbance rather than one of cognition. And then in the 80s, which is when I would have been at primary school as a child through the 80s, there was a criteria change, and it was categorised by a lack of interest in people, severe impairments in communication, and bizarre responses to environment, all developing in the first 30 months of life. By that time, it would have been too late for me, even if I had been displaying this sort of thing. So my parents wouldn't have known necessarily that there was anything wrong with me or different about me through any of my childhood, let alone in the first 30 months of life, and these things were quite extreme to get that diagnosis in terms of how, in terms of support needs. 94 revised again, 2000 revised again, 2013 we've got DSM-5. Throughout my parents' life, my life, and the lifespan of my children are now into their early adulthood, there hasn't been a criteria at the right time that would have captured our experience. What does that say for attachment theory? I don't think attachment theory has captured the way autistic people relate. I don't think attachment theory can capture the autistic experience until there's enough washed out data where the parents are diagnosed appropriately and the children are diagnosed appropriately, and both the parents and the children have been supported appropriately throughout their life. You've got a whole generation of people my age who have gone through parenthood already before they're diagnosed. So any damage and patterns that are with me, that have been brought up with me, have been passed on to my children. Thankfully, for me, with a bit of insight now, I can start to talk through and undo and rework some of those problems and issues with my adult children before they have children. Attachment theory has prioritised a way of attaching to people that is not in keeping with my reality. I attached to my parents appropriately, I felt. I understood the family relationships intellectually, and I got from my family what I thought and felt was appropriate. Did I feel that they completely understood me? Well, sometimes yes, but not really. And sometimes it was chronically invalidating, and to the point of I felt occasionally that I was being punished for showing up as I showed up, and blamed for or told that I didn't have feelings, I didn't emote properly or appropriately, and that I was rejecting them or cold or distant. Now, I don't want to leave it like that and think that my parents were horrible. Usually I had been probably pretty badly behaved or challenging when those things were thrown around at me, but needless to say, it still hurts to think that at some point in time your parent or parents are seeing you as cold and detached when actually you're anything but, you're just misunderstood. But during that time, went literally through my childhood of the autism diagnosis coming closer and getting further away, closer and getting further away in terms of the criteria. So just when it looks like it might capture someone like me, it moves back again and it doesn't capture someone like me. Society is notoriously slow to change. So society was probably still blaming mothers until, in fact, why am I saying probably? I've been a mother. I was a mother in the 2000s and I felt blamed if my children weren't going to turn out right, that it would be my fault. And that's even given the fact that I co-parented very heavily with my husband. And we also had other adults around us, in parents-in-law. My father-in-law, for example. I just dropped my magnet. But even then, it was clear that society was still seeing the mother as pivotal. I'll go further and say that whenever I had concerns around the development of my children, and I went to the doctors and then went on to professional mental health services, I got the feeling that they were judging me without helping me, I must say. So attachment theory is something that massively triggers me when I hear about it. I'm actually shouldn't say that, because it might not, now that I've reflected on it a bit more. It's not a neutral, it hasn't been a neutral tool. Attachment theory has been around for long enough for it to influence popular culture around this thing called the mother load, or the primary carer load, which, let's face it, has mostly been the mother. In terms of the psychological development of their children, anything not normal or outside of the norm is a better way of putting that, has been something that the mother has typically been blamed for by professionals who are there supposedly to help us understand ourselves, help us make better connections and better relationships. In my case, for my children, I definitely would have benefited from knowing I was autistic before I had my children, during their early childhood, and even by the time they were teenagers. Not knowing was extremely difficult for me and for them. And I wish it wasn't. I wish it hadn't been. The way I showed up and parented looked sometimes like rejection or aloofness or lack of connection, when actually it was anything but. Going back in time, this, I could say, similar to my mum and myself, the years of misunderstanding of where I was coming from and how I felt about things and what I wanted and what I needed. I feel attachment theory is, in trying to sum up different types of nuanced relationships, it's missed completely around neurodiversity, and I don't think it will be just autism that is not reflected in the way that relationships are defined in attachment theory. I really really think that we need to stop and think about relationships in a much broader sense, and about why people are, or like why an individual is relational and how they're demonstrating that relational capacity. I'd like to see more involvement in other types of relationships. I'd like to see professional psychologists, when they're dealing with adults, look and reflect on the relationships they've made as adults. I have a very deep and long-term and rewarding relationship with my husband, for example. Does that mean that I'm good at relationships or bad, if you compare that to the relationships I've had with my mum and my dad or my sisters or whatever? What about the relationships that we have outside of human relationships with animals, who are arguably easier to understand and more predictable, and also require a lot of care and attention and investment, and that feel like they get us more? What about the relationships we have with our special interests or our passions? The attachment theory criteria is far, far too one-dimensional to think about and value and assess the many nuanced ways that humans not only how they relate and the behaviour they display in that relationship, but also why we relate and what we're gaining or trying to learn through those relationships. And I'd really like to finish by saying, look, let's share our experiences of being relational and having relationships, and give some lived experience data so that psychologists and mental health professionals can actually see what it was like for us, why we did the things we did, and what we expected. I didn't expect to see myself in my parents, or to have them enjoy everything I did, or feel or think the same way. It didn't occur to me that they were going to think the same way as I did, because I didn't see anybody. I didn't get any information that people were thinking and feeling the same as I did. I knew from an early age, perhaps sooner than a neurotypical person might, that you can have the same thing happen to a group of people and everyone think differently of it. I found that curious for a start, and wondered, well, why do some people get upset and some people not? And does that mean the ones that are upset are good, or the ones that aren't upset are good? But I noticed that, and I started processing that. I think that means that relationally, I'm actually pretty good. It doesn't mean to say I want a lot of relationships in my life, or that I'm going to look for emotional synchronicity with other people. So I've let that sink in for a day, and then I've come back today after editing and whatnot, and I thought the best thing I can do is sum up the 5 points that I've learned from going through this process. I want to reiterate that I'm not an expert in attachment theory. I'm aware that it's just a tool, and that different psychologists and different professionals will use it in different ways. But what I'm trying to reflect on in this video is how that understanding and the value that it places on human connectedness in this particular way, and about how it measures what we see, is not just something that's it's not just a tool that psychologists use. This is how society values humans. This is how society reflects how human we are. So it's like, what came first, attachment theory or humans, how humans value people and how they relate? I don't know, I really don't know. But what I'm trying to sum up in this piece is the role attachment theory as a theory has, and then how it's manifested in society, has contributed to my perceptions of self and my trauma. So that's really what I'm doing here. So 5 things. The first thing, not human. So for me, attachment theory plays into my core vulnerability as someone who's neurodivergent and frequently misunderstood. I primarily seek attachments from the inside out rather than the outside in. I would best describe my motivational anchor as autonomous rather than relational. I can see how emotional trauma damages our human capacity to relate and attach to others, and I can understand how and why my healthy norms have been misinterpreted as unhealthy or pathological. So that's number 1. Number 2, reading the perception rather than the underlying reality, so it links. I feel attachment theory assessment tools have been designed to preference that which can be observed and casually explained, rather than that what might be happening at a deeper level. I feel it might be the public rather than the private self that's being measured, even in these most intimate of settings. And this makes sense to me given that people often hide their true selves. It could be, even in a family, it could be body dysmorphia, gender dysmorphia, sexuality, political views, aspirations. We don't necessarily share all of that with our parents, and some people stop sharing that stuff very, very young. So there's definitely a public, private self, even in intimate and personal relationships. I don't feel that's captured in attachment theory. Number 3 are drive capacity and orientation. I'm in no doubt that deep, healthy emotional connectedness with other humans enriches my life. However, I have neither the motivational drive nor the capacity to extend that in the way that attachment theory describes. My ability to bend, stretch and adapt in the presence of others is limited, and as such, I tend to form the best connections with those who value constructing a relationship that honours the individuality and autonomy of both parties. To put it another way, I work towards building relationships that reduce or eliminate the need for a public-private self. You can be your full self with me. Number 4, attribution of power. And I think this is an important one. This feels important to me. Attachment theory lends itself to the perpetuation of the refrigerator mother trope, or what I also call the mother load, blaming mothers, and in these days should be parents, for the perceived, not actual, failings of their children. I'm not denying that a child's primary caregiver holds the most power in the carer-child relationship, but I do feel it's time we appropriately acknowledged and empowered the child's voice, reality and motivation too, and that we don't assume it to be just a cookie cutter. Every child is going to come out as a blank slate. I don't feel that's true. Personally, I found it helpful to think about my parent-child relationships in terms of their fit. The relationship might feel comfortable, the right fit, too tight, too loose, triggering, or just plain irritating at any given time. And that's from my perspective. So in any child relationship, parent relationship, there's times when it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel like it's flowing, and other times when it feels great and lovely and amazing. Thinking of it this way reminds both people in the relationship that it is a relationship, that it's something that is created and worn together, something that both parties are responsible for and can contribute to developing in both positives and negative ways. It also reminds me that we must accept and work with the tools we have, and I feel that's important too. We're bringing our real selves to that role, and we may or may not have the appropriate capacity at any given time, and we should be supported to find that. Last one, number 5, intergenerational trauma. My final reflection offers hope for the future. I'm not the only actually autistic nearly 48-year-old to have recently discovered their true authentic self. I feel the data used to construct attachment theory failed me because it didn't know me, didn't recognise me. This wasn't my fault, not my parents' fault, not my grandparents' or their parents' fault, but it's now time to stop. I feel I'm nearing the end of my trauma journey, that I'm almost healed of my complex PTSD, not because of attachment theory or an understanding of it, but in spite of it. I've always followed my instincts no matter how uncomfortable, invalidating or desperate. Now I know why, and I can use that knowledge to support, validate and advocate for others, including myself. So that's what I got from doing this, quite a lot I think. I think it's been very helpful for me, and it feels like it's been a big final push of the puzzle of what's made life quite traumatic for me. So I hope that that's been interesting for you. Thank you again for watching and listening and sharing on this journey with me.